In celebration of Earth Month, we'd like to thank this month's sponsor, Big Pivot Partners. Big Pivot is an award-winning communications design firm with solutions ranging from sustainability and corporate responsibility projects like ESG, DE&I, and TCFD reports to investor communications. As strategic consultants, they've earned a reputation for delivering strategic, creative solutions with hands-on project management that ensures projects deliver on time and within budget. Enjoy this episode.
Hi everyone, welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today I'm welcoming Mike Smith with Aclymate to the podcast. Mike, thank you for being here.
Hi Kaitlyn, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike is the CEO and co-founder of Aclymate, a Denver-based climate tech startup building carbon accounting and offsetting software specifically to help small and medium-sized businesses manage and report their impact on the climate. Previously, Mike founded RenewWest, where he developed the largest carbon reforestation project in U.S. history, the 2 million tree Collins-Modoc project. He is a former U.S. Navy FA-18 pilot with 354 carrier-arrested landings across 3 deployments, ultimately attaining the rank of commander. Mike, super interesting background. We're really excited to dig into this today.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a journey.
Absolutely. And we will get to that journey. But I do want to say, for transparency's sake, that ClimeCo has an investment in Aclymate. And I can speak a little bit to that in that, you know, most of our work is focused on really large companies, really large corporations, but we believe at ClimeCo that Aclymate is doing something important and unique in focusing on that small, medium enterprise SME sector. And so, that's my only full disclosure point is that we do have an investment, but it's really because we believe in the power of Aclymate to make an impact in that section of the economy. So with that, let's talk a little bit about your journey, Mike. How did you come to found a climate startup for small businesses?
Yeah, it has been a bit of a journey. So as you mentioned in my bio there, so I used to fly F-18s for the U.S. Navy, spent about 12 and a half years active duty doing that. And it was just a great way to spend my 20s, a really exciting lifestyle, for some people, a real dream career. But in 2010, I got married. And in 2011, I took my wife to Idaho, which is where I grew up, to kind of show her where all the sites that were familiar to me. And as we're touring the state, we ended up going by this fire scar for the Loman Fire. The Loman Fire burned in 1989. It was about 44,000 acres. It was kind of the first of the mega fires. Anymore, 44,000 acres seems like a drop in the bucket. But at the time, it felt like the whole state was burning. And as a child, I was 9 when it happened. It put up a mushroom cloud, pyrocumulonimbus cloud, that was like super memorable to me, kind of as a child of the late Cold War. And I said, that doesn't look right. And everybody said, don't worry about it. It'll grow back, or, somebody will replant it. And I said, okay, great. I'm 9. What do I know? And so 22 years later, here I am with my wife, Lindsay, and I see that it's not growing back. And that led me to do a little bit of think work about what I wanted to do with my life. I'd studied about carbon markets a little bit at the Naval Academy when I was a student, kind of on my own volition. I just was convinced I could do something about it. So it led me to taking a pretty hard turn out of the Navy to start a company about post-fire reforestation for climate outcomes called RenewWest. RenewWest has grown into kind of a natural and working lands carbon company, so not exclusively carbon offsets, and it's just kind of the intersection of where natural and working lands interact with the climate and how you can help to bring market forces to do that. When I looked at all the ways that we could do that reforestation, that kind of restoration work, I saw that there was a lot of great people that were doing a lot of great work within kind of the nonprofit sector. And because of that background of understanding the carbon markets, I just became convinced that there were some opportunities around that. So founded RenewWest, have made some great things happen there. Specifically, the Collins-Modoc project is probably our biggest claim to fame right now. It's the largest project of its type in U.S. history, 2 million trees plus. And I couldn't be more proud of that. But along the way, I was also an advisor to the U.S. Climate Alliance, also on natural and working lands, climate policy, et cetera. So the Climate Alliance is the 20 plus states that stayed in the Paris Accords after the Trump administration pulled us out before Biden brought us back in, and it still continues to operate. And so there was a lot of smart people that were getting paid to care about carbon markets and climate policy. And as I was advising them, it seemed as if carbon markets were a little difficult for them. And I got to thinking about like, man, what are we doing here? We're created a system that we're only sustainability professionals for Fortune 500 companies that have spent years kind of focusing on this can actually properly engage without the help of some intermediary expert. And that didn't sit right either. And so as part of that, and about like wanting to kind of make carbon markets and climate accounting accessible to the layperson, started Aclymate internal to RenewWest as kind of a side project. Was very fortunate to be joined by my co-founder at Aclymate, a guy named William Lupesco, who works as our CTO. We developed it internally as a kind of a part-time project for RenewWest for a bit, and then it grew its own legs. And so we had to make the decision about whether Aclymate would be an internal project and whether that would, because it was a tech company inside of kind of a larger, forest, focused, but broadly, lands focused company, or to spin it out. And so we had to spin it out. I left RenewWest behind in the very capable hands of my co-founder, a guy named John Cleland, who's now the CEO there at RenewWest, and I went and started Aclymate. And so that's how I got here. Went through Techstars Sustainability, which is a fairly well-known accelerator within the tech startup ecosystem. And then we've just been out there doing the work since. And to go back to your previous comment, which is that we couldn't be prouder of that investment that we got from ClimbCo and our partnership with them. Like, I've known ClimbCo for years, as back in my RenewWest days. Derek Six, Lauren Beachak are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet. And so it's just nice to be partnered with the right people.
Well, we certainly feel the same way. Thank you for that, Mike. You mentioned something I want to come back to. You mentioned that when you were advising the U.S. Climate Alliance, you were frustrated that it almost like you had to have this Fortune 500 kind of pedigree to really understand this stuff, and it's perhaps more complicated than it needs to be. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I think that's an interesting concept. But I can resonate with it because that's why we have this podcast, ESG Decoded, because we're trying to help everybody kind of understand it. And we realize that a lot of this can be very, very complex and technical.
Yeah. When I first started RenewWest, I spent about 6 months in the Denver Public Library just trying to teach myself everything I could about the material. And I checked out this book about climate accounting for forestry. And in it, there was a series of authors. And so I reached out to the authors to kind of see like if I had some questions that weren't covered in the material. And one of the authors, when I spoke with him, he was a professor at a university, and he said, well, you need to go get a master's in order to really understand this. And one, I thought that was a bit patronizing, but also two is like, yeah, that's not true. Like the sum total of human knowledge like exists in the library. It exists in the phone in my pocket, right? Like we don't, you can go learn this stuff. But he wasn't wrong in the larger construct, which is that like it takes a lot of effort to kind of go and look at this and to learn the material, et cetera. And the people that do that like are kind of the first ones to do that, like they tend to work for very large organizations that tend to have deep pockets and that have like a big focus on certain objectives, and their motivations in supporting those large organizations are going to be different from the layperson's, and that's a natural and appropriate thing, right? And so as part of that, like you start creating things like scopes, right? And so for listeners of your podcast who are, I'm sure, very well familiar with like the definition of like scope 1, 2, and 3, that's great. But for the rest of the world, like when you mention like, what are your scope 2 emissions? Their eyes roll back, or there's actually sometimes a little bit of fear. Like they just like, what is this, right? Like, and that is just entry stakes for the language to approach that. That's not a system that's going to work. Not for the larger system. The IPCC in their 2018 report, one of the quotes that came out of this was, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and most importantly for what they said is that every choice matters. And so like when people start engaging with climate, they don't think about it in scopes. Scopes are really kind of a way for large organizations to kind of pass the buck a little bit. It's a way for you to say, well, scope 1 is my responsibility. Okay, I'll take responsibility for scope 2, but scope 3 is somebody else. Somebody else is doing those emissions. Now, more and more people aren't accepting that, but that's kind of the original idea behind scope emissions is that like, I'll take responsibility for what's most directly under my control.
Which is common sense too, right? Like, you have to start within your fence line, and that makes sense. But I totally agree with the idea that it's technical and it's all evolving. You have science-based targets and that sort of thing that are saying, no, we have to look at scope 3 as well, which is everybody else. And that everybody else has a lot of small businesses, right?
Yeah, exactly. What's really refreshing about talking to these small businesses is that they don't think that way. Scopes is like saying it's got to be in either category 1 or category 2 or category 3. It's got to be categorized. We have to use our mind to do that. And that's how humans like to think. There's all sorts of neurological studies about that. But in reality, what scopes really talk about are relationships. And those relationships are talked about shared responsibility, right? And it's kind of silly for us to think about that, that the embodied carbon in fossil fuels are not the responsibility of the fossil fuel company. But it's also naive of us to think that it's not also the responsibility of the consumer of that fossil fuel. Right. And everybody's kind of, the fossil fuel companies are saying that we're only selling this because somebody's buying it. Right. Well, the flip side is the people are saying, well, we're only buying it because we're in a system where we need to use this in order to power our society. And the reality is it's a shared responsibility. We all have to be part of that. And those decisions and informing those decisions are important.
It really is a interesting way to think about it, that scopes are about, it's an accounting framework, essentially. That's what it is. What you're talking about is the real impact happens in the relationship. And so I just wanted to jump in to highlight that because that's really, really insightful. And I think maybe sometimes in the world of climate change and accounting, we can get a little too hung up on this number belongs in this category and that number belongs in that category and who's responsible for that. But what you're saying is that, yes, that's fine as an accounting exercise, but the whole point is that the relationship between the parties is what really matters here.
100%. And I'm not even saying that it's fine. I think it's good. I think it's a good thing to have an accounting framework that people should think through if you're an expert.
Yeah, of course.
But I don't want us to get lost, to lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
Here, which is the ultimate reason that we have this is to enact change, positive change from a climate perspective, reducing risk from an ESG perspective. And the way that you do that is by enabling relationships. And those relationships are about shared responsibility associated with these behaviors.
I think that's really interesting because, you noticed then, following on to that is that there was a kind of a gap in the market, right? That the sort of average small, medium enterprise or SME wasn't able to access the same level of service, but the same level of knowledge because of the complication of an accounting system. So you guys have designed Aclymate, as far as I understand it, to kind of be the answer to that. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. When we looked at the space, we saw that there were the existing solutions for businesses broadly were that they could hire an expert either internally or externally through kind of a consultancy sort of outfit. That was a time intensive process. A lot of capital had to be kind of dedicated to such a resource. And even for your SMB, that was thousands of dollars just to access that. And then on the back end of that experience, they were able to get an accounting that expert provided for them. And then the expert would, if they were an external, they would say, see you next year. And if they were internal, then, that was a different thing. But for SMBs, you weren't having an internal, it was just too much time for that.
Some listeners that aren't based in English speaking countries. And I said SME, small, medium enterprise. Mike said SMB, small, medium business, same thing. I just wanted to make that clarification if anyone's listening that's not a native English speaker.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So that was one solution, is hire an expert. The other solution was teach yourself. And as we did customer interviews, we found people that were tracking all their airline miles by going to Google Maps and putting in the routes and trying to putting into a spreadsheet and then putting the total number in as their flight miles. And that's just not an accurate way of doing it. It's super time intensive. It's a pretty poor user experience. At the time we were getting started on this, there were a few companies that were targeted on the large Fortune 500 type power users that have defined a lot of these scope 1, 2 emissions, kind of frameworks, which is great. And those companies that are supporting that, those numbers have exploded, which is just kind of demonstrating how much demand there is in the market and how much money is kind of pouring into climate tech more broadly. There still remains, I think, a fairly sizable gap, though, is in supporting the SMB, SME type customer with what they need. They need accounting that is approachable, but that doesn't require a certain degree of expertise. They need something that's affordable, that is a clear and easy to evaluate price point. But they also need something with power. Most of the solutions that have kind of tailored to them a little bit aren't really tailored at all. They're just kind of like this very broad spend-based accounting where like you put in how much money you spent on airfare last year and it gives you an approximation. And that's a problem because it doesn't actually tell people where their emissions are coming from or how to make the emissions reductions. It doesn't tie that data to, employees within their company or to, underlying true data. You can buy the same plane ticket on Frontier 6 months out or United tomorrow, essentially the same airplane going the same route, same size seat, and you're going to spend potentially 100 times more on the United ticket as you would on the Frontier that I just gave. Right. So a spend-based accounting is also not particularly accurate. So how do you give them like real power, but also make it approachable and affordable?
So I guess then if we have any small, medium businesses listening, they could go check out acclimate.com. Of course, the spelling is in the will be in the episode notes and the website, of course. But other kind of pro tips you have for the users, so your customers at Aclymate.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that it's a journey. Just like I had my own kind of personal journey, how I came to Climate, it's your journey too. And when you think about it as your journey, it almost kind of doesn't matter what you've done. It matters what you're going to do. And so, give yourself a little permission to, I could have done better in the past, but let's not worry about that. Let's focus on what we can do now. The very first thing that you can do now is get a baseline. I'll tell you, you probably have a bunch of assumptions about like what you're doing, and some of them are probably true, but some of them are probably not. We've had users that have assumed that like it was airfare and travel that was going to be like their big emissions related thing. And it turns out it was one particular commuter, caused much higher emissions than like the person that flew in from Argentina. And so like there's a lot of stuff that's kind of buried in there. And so challenge your assumptions by getting to real data. We're happy to help you with that at Aclymate, ACLYMATE.com. But however you need to get started, get started. The other thing I would say is don't feel like you have to do everything all at once. It can be overwhelming. You can think about like if you have manufacturing or you're in some sort of production, like that you want to tackle your entire supply chain. And that's great. But going back again to kind of that original scope 1-2 framework here is like start with what you can control most immediately. I'll tell you like the stuff that's happening in the scope 3 space. I'm sure your listeners are well familiar at this point. Like it's messy. And that's only going to improve with time. And so this is not to say don't engage with that, but just start with what you can engage with. There are some meaningful things that you can do right now associated with that. And then the last thing I would say here is it's not an either or, again, kind of in this false categorization of like it's only emissions reductions or it's only offsetting. It's kind of both. Like the most responsible companies do both. And the net zero framework essentially requires that we do that, and that we figure out ways that we reduce our emissions. That's why at Aclymate, we've tried to make our pricing as approachable as possible. So that way there should be no barrier for you to do that. But on the flip side there, building an internal price of carbon through an offsetting commitment, I think is a valuable exercise for any company.
I kind of want to switch gears to this perspective you have being a veteran. But before we do that, is there anything else you wanted to add about Aclymate and small, medium businesses taking steps in their climate journey?
The only other thing I would add to that is that as part of that journey, there is an educational component to it. And so listening to podcasts like this are a great way to start. But again, give yourself permission to not know some things and get started, and then find somebody that you trust or a couple somebodies that you trust and that you can listen to. That's part of what we do at Aclymate, is to help people to learn a little bit more when they're ready and as they can move forward. But we also have to give ourselves a little bit of permission, which is that like the whole small to medium-sized businesses don't have full-time sustainability people. These are people that are wearing a hat in addition to many other hats. And so when you can fit it in, learn. When you can't fit it in, focus on your business. The goal here should be to make your business as competitive as possible at the same time that you're also dealing with climate, so we can displace people that aren't doing that. And so don't think about this as kind of I've always hated the framework that like that being positive for the environment is like a detraction to business outcomes. I think any listener to the ESG podcast would kind of understand that no, actually they're reinforcing, they're mutually beneficial outcomes. And so when you do that, just recognize that you have to, part of that is carrying your business forward as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Well said. Mike, well, first of all, thank you for your service. It's amazing to see our third veteran on this podcast, and we've only been around 2 years or so. So not a huge sample size, but we've had 3 veterans on this podcast who specifically went into the climate technology space. You are the third. So I'm noticing a pattern. And I wondered if you had any thoughts. Is there a reason that you see veterans going into this space from your perspective?
Sure. So yeah, obviously can't speak for all veterans. What I can speak for what attracted me, and I think would probably speak to other veterans, but everybody's journey is different. What attracted me was I didn't join the military for a job. I joined the military for an experience, right? And part of that experience was that I wanted to not totally live like a 9-to-5 life, not, with the desk job. I wanted to go out and see the world and experience it. I wanted to have a mission that was kind of part of like why I got out of bed in the morning, and that was great. I had those experiences, and it was, like I said, it's just a phenomenal way to live your 20s. But I also, while I was in the service, grew a little frustrated that to a certain part, like when you're in the military, like you got to fit like this pre-assigned role, and there's not a ton of flexibility in career associated with that. I was growing like eager to go and do more, and that's what led me to getting out of the service and to seeing, is there a way that I could like use my talents as I see them best in order to achieve an outcome on the world, effectively a mission. And that helped me to get into climate, to stay focused on climate. And like it really is part of like how I identify myself now as somebody that's really committed to our climate future, and that's a priority for me. And I think that speaks to other veterans, which is that, can you have a mission of working on things beyond yourself? Can it be something that's a little atypical, a little bit different, maybe a little bit more risky than something, but where the payoffs for the world and for yourself are potentially a little bit greater? And I think that is something that kind of speaks to veterans, at least some of them. The U.S. population is something like 7% of them are veterans. So it's a pretty sizable chunk of our country. I would still hazard that we're probably underrepresented within the climate space broadly. When you think about just how many are there, most veterans go into defense-related activities after they leave the service, or related to a skill that they learned. It's a pretty big emotional leap to take this and just completely jump into something totally different. And so what I would encourage people in climate broadly, or sustainability broadly, or ESG broadly, is if you run into a veteran that is transitioning and asking for a couple of questions, please make some time for them. That's not the easiest path for them, and they're having to make a big jump. And it's a big change in identity as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Mike. I think about this national security perspective as well, too. I know a number of reports from the U.S. military looking at the national security implications related to the impacts of climate change. This is something you've worked on, too. Am I right?
Yeah, a little bit. I've done some writing on this. So in the military, they talk about things called force multipliers, which is that having a certain weapon system makes a soldier not like having it's not like having one more soldier, it's like having 10 more soldiers, right? Well, there's also threat multipliers. And climate, in my opinion, and in the growing opinion of people that are within the space, is it is the greatest threat multiplier we have out there. And it's a slow burn sort of thing. Climate's a very difficult policy problem, but from a national security standpoint, it's a real mess. To give you an example, there's been, if anybody's ever read the book by Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry of the Future, that talks about it's a great nonfiction or great fiction book that's not so fiction-y in many ways. And it talks about there's this very grim first like 5 chapters of the book where she writes about like from her character's perspective, essentially dying of heat in India, because there's, depending on where we go on which RCP pathway, et cetera, there are some potential pathways where big chunks of the Indian subcontinent, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, have fatal heat. A concept of that, like if you don't have air conditioning, it doesn't matter the amount of water or shade you have or a fan, you die. It's because the dew point is high enough and the temperature is high enough that like perspiration won't cool you down.
May I jump in just to define RCP was the representative concentration pathway, and those scenarios can be found in the IPCC reports for anyone who wants to look them up. Go ahead.
Anyways, what Ms. Robinson did like in her book was like really make this like a very like experiential way of what it would be like to essentially like see an entire region die because the power falls and like air conditioning goes, right? It's a pretty gruesome thing that's still on the table. That's still a potential outcome for us. And when you think about that, like what happens when there's a place in the world where it's too hot to live? And that's like a place where like millions and millions of people live. Okay, now combine that with Bangladesh is also like one of the most susceptible, the Ganges-Brahmaputra river delta is one of the most susceptible to sea level rise. What happens when you have huge, and by the way, we're already currently experiencing the highest number of displaced people in the history of the planet. Now, most of them are internally displaced, and that's a number that people don't think about, but like they can't live where they were at their home. They're moving out. And so that happens for a little bit. People will stay inside of their country because it's the most familiar, and they move from one place to the next, and sometimes they just settle. But as the temperature keeps turning up, those things are going to start cascading. And people are going to start flowing out of borders. And you start thinking about the national security implications and the political implications of like Syrian refugees in Europe, or, refugees, economic refugees generally associated with, Central America moving into the United States, and how that destabilizes our political system. And then you start combining that in with like in the Indian subcontinent area, Pakistan and India are historic rivals. Both of them are nuclear armed states. They border a third nuclear armed state, China, which has its own host of problems. And you start getting these tipping points that you just don't come back from. And that gets really scary really fast. This is kind of one of those stitch in time scenarios, which is like we need to take RCP 8.5, which is like the really high concentration, lots and lots of heat sort of stuff. We need to take that off the table, because when you start having like big resource constraints and a lot of people moving around, you're going to have like massive destabilization. We're only starting to see just the first little samples of that. So I try not to think about that too much because it's a pretty dark and scary place to go. And I try to be a little bit more about like, what can I do in the present for that? And for me, that was helping to empower others to make those decisions to help avoid those worst outcomes.
I think it's important that you brought all of that up, Mike, because I think it might not be to the layperson an obvious leap to national security, but that's in fact, been top of mind at the World Economic Forum's risk reports for years now. I mean, years. I can't remember the first time I read one. It's been a long time. And there was always that linkage between climate change and or natural disasters, whether or not they can be proved to be linked to climate change, the relationship between those and displacement of people, poverty, war, it's like a very scary domino effect. And but it's not necessarily common knowledge, right? And so it's fascinating to think about it from a national security perspective, and perhaps more veterans will be motivated to work in this space. I think it's certainly not the note we want to end on. Like, can we think of something else to wrap up on, Mike?
Internal to my company, I have an onboarding process for like new employees, new hires, interns, and I've become somewhat famous for like telling them like why we all care about climate change, right? And they all come out with kind of their eyes wide open, right? And they're a little intimidated, and like they even jokingly refer to it as like my doom and gloom speech, right? When you look at like all the different concentration path RCPs, there are no great solutions at this point. We're now at a point where we have only a bad outcome. It's a question between bad worse disaster, like cataclysm, right? But it means that like we still have choices. We can still steer this to a certain direction. And that we have opportunities to be part of that solution. And when you look at what I like to refer to the climate generation, millennials and Gen Z, the eldest millennials, by the way, are like in their 40s now, so entering the peak of their political and economic power. And they're overwhelmingly motivated by climate. Politically, this is where like you see a breakdown. Pew Research shows this, even in Republicans versus Democrats here domestically, where conservative, like Republican millennials care about climate. And that's a break from kind of their boomer and Gen X elders. The climate generation cares about climate. They're acting and they're buying according to climate. Within the SMB context, something like 75% of all millennials will take a pay cut to work at a company that has like good ESG metrics to them. 2/3 of them won't work at all for a company that doesn't. Right? Like this is something that they're engaging with in like real big and meaningful ways. And I'm pretty excited about that. The other part that I would say here is kind of within kind of the choices part. There's a professor at MIT, a guy named John Stearman, who talks about that there are no silver bullets in climate. There's silver buckshot. Unfortunately, we're past the point of where we can kind of do like one thing and that'll be the thing that solves the climate change problem. We now have to kind of do all the things. And so again, in this mindset of false categorization about like where we have to choose the perfect path. You know, it's either like small modular reactors or bust. No, that's not it, right? Like the answer is we have to do all the things. And so pretty much like wherever you want to get in on the fight, you're needed and you're valued, and it will make a difference. You know, I don't want to give like a false hope. Like there's some real challenges and some stuff coming to us, but like we have real opportunities to really be part of that change. And I get excited about that.
It's why I love this concept of using markets. And that's really what ClimeCo is all about, is how do we use markets, use novel finance, create new commodities that incentivize the behaviors that have the impact that we want on the world. And it's really cool. There's a lot that's not yet written. I mean, we have a team that all they do is look at potential new projects, potential new commodities, and could that have an impact? So it's really exciting time for sure. So thank you. Much better note to end on. Well, Mike, thank you so much for being on. We appreciate you, and super interesting show. I think folks will find it really insightful. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Kaitlyn. I enjoyed being here.
Thanks again to this month's sponsor, Big Pivot Partners. Learn more by visiting www.bigpivot.net.